All right. Good evening and welcome to everybody tonight's program at the Commonwealth Club. I'm Kit Yarrow. I'm Professor Emerita at Golden Gate University. And joining us tonight are Chris Clearfield and Andras Tilcsik. They're co-authors of the new book, Meltdown: Why Our Systems Fail and What We Can Do About It. So failure is a seemingly inevitable part of life. However, surprising new research shows that the myriad of failures that dominate headlines every day have similar causes. Chris and Andras believe that if we understand what lies behind these failures, we can make better decisions at work and at home. Chris is the founder of System Logic, an independent research and consulting firm focusing on issues of risk and complexity, and Andras is the Canadian Research Chair in Strategy, Organizations, and Society at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Chris Clearfield and Andras Tilcsik to the Commonwealth Club. All right, so we got a good little overview of your book already, and I'm wondering if you would share with us a couple of your favorite failures.
Oh, there's so many
Yeah,
failures.
give us your favorite one.
I think one of the reasons we came to the book was because Andras and I were both looking from different perspectives. Andras is a researcher, and myself from somebody who was at the time working on Wall Street and seeing a pretty big meltdown there in the financial crisis. And, what we saw is that there were all these failures, and there seemed to be factors that related once we started digging into them. So I think for me, the real moment was living through the financial crisis, kind of seeing some of it from the inside as a trader working, and seeing, how different organizations failed, and some did well and some obviously didn't do so well. And then just a couple years later, BP had their big Deepwater Horizon oil rig explosion. And as we started to look into that, we realized that these events really had a lot in common, and that was kind of the impetus for starting to look at this stuff with a wider lens.
So use the BP as an example then to illustrate what failures have in common.
So, BP is it's a great example of a huge failure in so many ways. Obviously, first of all, there's the tragedy of the loss of life and the massive environmental destruction that happened, which, we should just acknowledge because it's so important and so devastating. But when you think about the accident itself, when you look into what actually happened, it wasn't that it wasn't that a huge set of mistakes were made. It was that a handful of really small problems kind of snowballed together to form this really devastating consequence. And the Deepwater Horizon oil spill is an example of what we struggle with in these complex systems, because we can't see what's going on inside the oil rig. We can't understand. They were drilling miles under the ocean and then even more miles under the seafloor to get to this oil. And that's something that we can't observe directly. Mm. So they had to rely on computer models, and in some cases they relied on intuition. It turned out incorrectly. And so what you have is this system where these small failures could come together, cause this really devastating failure. That's the kind of complexity element of it. And then we see the tight coupling, which we talked about, you saw in the video, where once the oil spill started to happen, they couldn't put the genie back in the bottle. They couldn't fix it. The oil had nowhere to go but up, and up it went.
Mm-hmm. Right. Do you have a favorite example, Andras?
Yeah, so maybe not a single one, but I think one thing that surprised us as we started working on this book, Chris and I thought we'll be writing about BP, Deepwater Horizon, Enron, nuclear disasters, things like that. And then the more time we spent on this, the more we saw these sort of smaller failures, or failures that affected us at home or in our cars or in everyday life or when we were traveling. And we saw really the same kind of patterns as we did with these big failures. And so, one that really struck us as something that happened just so often. In fact, it happened again just 2 days ago or yesterday, the airlines.
Yeah.
Right.
So, there's all these cases where airlines had to ground their entire fleets of planes, and not because there was anything wrong with the pilots, not because there was anything wrong with the planes, but because somebody unplugged a power cord in a data center, or there was a glitch in the reservation system. And then next thing you know, you have tens of thousands of people stranded, and some of them for days. And it's really this sort of small failure that snowballs into something much, much bigger. And then we saw this again 2 days ago in Europe, where 15,000 flights were delayed because of, again, a small computer glitch.
Mm-hmm. So breaking it apart, a system has to be incredibly complex, layer upon layer of innovation, I guess, is part of it. And a lot of your examples include technology as a component that's added to that complexity. Do you want to speak on that for a moment, how technology has impacted the complexity of businesses?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we talk about in the book is this idea of this kind of paradox of progress, that technology, we can't live without technology, right? To build on the airline example that Andras was just talking about, airlines, they don't have the capability to do paper tickets anymore, right? And even if they did, they wouldn't be able to do it at the scale that the kind of network of passengers require. So online reservations, online booking, I mean, that's something that gives us really tremendous capability. But what it does is it also creates a system that, like you're saying, kind of has layer upon layer built on it. And that creates the opportunity for really what's the heart of complexity, which is these unexpected interactions that can come from different parts of the system. And those interactions, they're hard to understand. So, when there's a problem, it's happening in computer code. It's not happening where someone can, see and touch
understand.
Right, exactly.
All of your examples, it seemed like seeing and understanding, there was like a lack of visibility. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about that is, one way we thought about it, and I think this relates to the question about technology as well, is that the answer to complexity isn't necessarily simplicity.
Yeah.
Right? So sometimes people have this urge like, oh, if complexity is the problem, the solution has to be simplicity. But what we actually see a lot of the times is that the answer is transparency rather than simplicity. And we see this with technology, but we also see it in other kinds of systems. So if you think about something sort of more harmless, think about something like the Oscars last year. Right. We all
La La Land.
La La Land. Sorry, it's
Moonlight.
It's Moonlight. I apologize. So it was actually a pretty complex failure, but it's not a very high-risk system. But one of the more interesting causes of that failure was the design of the envelopes that they used. So in 2017, they had these beautiful red envelopes with gold lettering on them, very Hollywood, looked great.
Super subtle,
elegant, and looks great, but it makes it very hard to read what the category name actually is, especially if you're standing backstage. And it's very hard for anyone to catch the error if I'm walking up to the stage with the wrong envelope. And if you look at what they did this year, I don't know if people have noticed that, but this year they have a really ugly design. It's this large envelope. It's black with enormous font. It says "Best Picture," and then in the middle again it says "Best Picture." I would design something like this if
right.
And I'm not very good at these things. And we see this kind of principle play out in a lot of places that we often have a preference for elegance and sleek, shiny things, but often those things make things less transparent, less visible, and as a result make it more difficult for us to catch problems.
Yeah. So you had also suggested that perhaps the cell phone smartphone played a role in the Academy Award snafu, that the guy was distracted. And then you have a couple of other examples, Starbucks, the tweeting example, and also the incident at Yale. So maybe could you speak for a moment about the role of our own personal technology, smartphones, in all of these disasters and catastrophes?
Yeah. So, I mean, backstage, one of the accountants from PwC, and it's really funny to say like backstage at the Oscars, an accountant, but that's who,
Yeah.
that's who runs the show. It's the accountants who hand out the envelopes and know the winners. He was maybe a little starstruck, right? So he's sort of tweeting pictures of celebrities as he's doing this job that requires a tremendous amount of focus, right? And it's all real time, and he has to kind of get it right. And so part of this is a story of human error. But that's true. That's always true, right? I mean, in most of the systems we're talking about, there's always people there. So it becomes then, how do you give people the tools to make the decisions that they need to make? And how do you make the system robust to those kind of failures? And the social media question, I think, is a really interesting one, and one that we were sort of surprised at as we started looking into it and doing the research. One of our favorite stories from the book is a social media campaign that Starbucks ran in the UK, where they wanted people to tweet, really sweet messages about liking gingerbread lattes, and they had this whole hashtag spread the cheer. And, it started out okay. But at the time, Starbucks was involved in this pretty big tax and kind of labor controversy in the UK. So pretty quickly, the tweets started to get, shall we say, a little more negative, a little more explicit.
Greedy parasites.
Right, greedy parasites. And that's one of the more polite ones. And what Starbucks had done to try to spread the cheer, if you will, was they had sponsored a screen at an ice skating rink that was showing these tweets, that was flashing them up on the screen as people, right? We see where this is going. And so Starbucks is, they're a sophisticated company. They have sophisticated media and marketing people. They had a content filter, but that content filter failed. And then what we see the very fact that the tweets were being displayed on the screen encouraged people to tweet about that. Mm-hmm. And so you end up with this whole kind of feedback loop where things really, they really blow up. And, that's something that is different in our age. It's sort of qualitatively different than it was even 10, 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. What you alluded to at Yale, do you want to talk about that actually, the kind of campus controversy?
Yeah, so people might remember this, the Yale campus controversy, which started with a discussion about appropriate and inappropriate Halloween costumes that students should or should not be wearing. And the story escalated. After a while, there was a confrontation between a number of students and a faculty member at Yale. And what really struck us about that story is that if that confrontation happened 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, it would have just stayed there. It would have just been a heated argument in a courtyard of a Yale dorm. But now, because there was somebody there with a cell phone, a smartphone, they recorded the conversation. Next thing you know, it was on YouTube, all over social media very quickly. And we saw the same kind of effect as with Starbucks. Very quickly, the genie's out of the bottle. Now, people from Hungary to Hong Kong are tweeting and writing about this, and that's really different. We just don't have that. I mean, your work on marketing. I think you must have seen this kind of changes in that space. But I think what Chris and I keep running into is that it's that same kind of fundamental change in any system, whether we are looking at our homes or these big, large organizations.
Adding complexity and a lack of visibility.
Yeah, and it's complexity in that kind of going back to that fundamental definition that we talked about a little bit before, or rather that the voice in the video talked about, which is it's complexity in the sense of connectedness. And that connectedness just didn't exist before. A lot of people are into buying local, right? So you go to a local farm stand, you know where that produce came from, you like that. Like maybe we should be encouraging people to have local controversies too, because that's not what we have anymore. And so the local stuff either kind of blows up and becomes huge, or it gets lost in the noise of a bigger conversation that people may not be able to affect in the same way.
Mm-hmm. Well, while we're on this topic here, one of my favorite stories was The Journalist. And I think the point you made was that because there was a layer of emotionality in his reporting, that he was able to be dishonest And also he manipulated the system to trick his editors. But I thought, oh, that's interesting, because you talked about technology, you talked about complexity, and all these different ways. And so I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about how emotionality is also a level of complexity.
Yeah. So this was this journalist, Jason Blair at the New York Times. Do people remember him? Yeah. So he wrote these stories that were pretty emotional, like, and it's kind of this sort of new age of journalism that's sweeping. He's not just reporting facts, right? He's reporting from, the front porch of a family who has a soldier that is missing in action in Iraq. He's reporting about the kind of heated confrontation between law enforcement officials when the Washington, D.C. sniper case was going big. This is 15 years ago at this point. And what was interesting was he wasn't actually in any of these places. He fabricated most of this reporting. And when we started looking at it, I mean, there's actually research on what kind of articles are more likely to be fabricated. And I mean, that in itself is fascinating. But you won't have an article fabricated about the Giants game, right? Because that's a pretty public thing. It's pretty easy to see.
Win or lose.
Right, exactly.
Score.
People will, there's a kind of a core truth there. But what Jason Blair was doing is he was writing about these emotional things, and so he was kind of stringing together these bits of facts with stories that he would steal from other journalists, with kind of things that he would see, and it really just slipped past his editors. And in part, it slipped past his editors because of the organizational complexity at the time. So he kind of was bounced around from news desk to news desk. He would submit expense reports from places where he wasn't. He would expense meals in Brooklyn when he was supposed to be in Washington, D.C., and vice versa. But the people who processed his expense reports, they didn't really pay attention to where he was supposed to be on assignment. So you kind of had him, really over and over, just making really pretty, doing pretty outrageous things and getting away with it for a long time, because there was this organizational complexity that he could kind of hide in.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So, in the world of retail, we've seen so many stores where there's been no catastrophe. It's just been a long failure to succeed, and they're dying. So, and ultimately, you could look at it as a catastrophe, but it's, and I think a lot of businesses are in that position where maybe rather than an incident happening, like a oil spill or something, there's just kind of like this slow, gradual failure. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I'm sure we have a lot of business owners and business people here that would love to just be more prepared. And what are the warning signs?
Yeah. So let me start with an example, and I think we can maybe, if you want to jump in with some warning signs.
Riff.
And yeah. So one story that comes to mind right away that we spent a lot of time on when researching the book actually comes from Chris's home, Washington State, which is the failure, this amazing failure of the Department of Corrections in Washington State, where for about 12 years. They were letting out prisoners too early. About 3,200 people, some of them violent felons, were released too early because of a small computer glitch in the system. And this is one of those failures that really just sort of went on and on and on for 12 years, and nobody noticed it. And there were some signs, but there wasn't really anything that jumped out. And this. The felons did not complain; they just left whenever the gates were open. And this was just this sort of amazing story to us because so we interviewed a state senator, and he said, when one prisoner escapes, we pull out all the stops to find them and stop them. But now we had this system that was letting out 3,200 of them over 12 years, and then it's just a system failure.
Yeah, and I think too, not every failure is a systems failure, but one of the things that was actually pretty exciting in the research we did is that the same kind of things that help organizations understand and catch these big system failures, they actually also help organizations innovate. So, having teams that have psychological safety, where they are willing to, speak about ideas, even if those ideas might be wrong. That kind of, or sort of bring up bad news, that helps teams not only catch these big kind of catastrophes, but it also helps them innovate. It helps them try new things. And I think it's really interesting when you look at the world like you're talking about. I mean, you wouldn't expect that an established retail player would be able to be outcompeted by a company that started in some guy's garage by shipping books. But that's totally fascinating, and I think that says something about how we think as people and how we how our organizations kind of sort of accrete this heaviness or accrete this complexity over time that we struggle with.
Yep, that makes perfect sense. Well, before we get on to the fixes, which was my favorite part of your book.
It's a very optimistic book.
Yeah, it is. But we got to define the problem, right? And the examples are so juicy, so it's super fun. But there's a few questions here that I think you'll enjoy. So one is, does the Trump administration use complexity to confuse, obscure, and appease his supporters and detractors? Okay, you can just run with that.
Yeah, that's a great question.
As a Canadian, I will pass on this question.
Thanks.
And comfortably sit back while Chris answers.
Go, Chris.
Well, I don't know about the Trump administration, but what we do know is that complexity, and this again was a surprising thing that that really just emerged from the research. Complexity, like we talked about with Jason Blair. Complexity really creates the opportunity for wrongdoing. It creates the opportunity for people to, as you're saying, or as the question says, people to get away with things by hiding their intent or, kind of obscuring the facts of what's going on. So I don't know about the Trump administration in particular, but what we do know is that Enron, for example, used complexity to hide their accounting tricks, and they really, very explicitly viewed complexity as one of their competitive advantages. I mean, here we are in California, right, where Enron, what's the polite way to say it, really messed with the energy markets. And they did that because they were really able to exploit the complexity that they saw and to create complexity. And so we do know that complexity kind of can create this platform where wrongdoing can really flourish.
Mm-hmm. So in a more general level, so that you could also participate, have you used, can you apply it to politics in general, like anywhere in the world where...
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think there are a number of lessons I think that might be applied. I think to politics, but also again you asked earlier about ordinary business decisions, and I think one of the things that really stood out to us was how much organizations and teams vary in their ability to learn from data and small failures and weak signals.
Right.
I have a prop here actually. I was reading the Chronicle this morning, and you can maybe see the headline here. It says, "Warnings before YouTube attack. Family alerted police shooter was angry and dangerous." And the funny thing is, it's not funny, it's tragic. If we had this conversation 2 weeks earlier, I would have picked up the Chronicle probably, and the headline might have been, Facebook had seen signs of problems with Cambridge Analytica in 2015. Mm-hmm. If we had this conversation 2 weeks before that, it would have been the Florida bridge and the cracks that we saw on that bridge, or some people saw on the bridge and then decided that it was not important enough. And but we do see some great examples, which I think that this sort of general principle can apply to again, both politics and really any kind of small business or large business. Some great examples where people figured out how to learn from these small failures to avoid big ones. Right. One of our favorite stories is about a nurse in a hospital. in Illinois who almost mixed up the medication of two patients, two elderly gentlemen who had very similar last names. They were prescribed drugs with very similar names, and they were in the same room. And she almost made this mistake. In the last moment, she caught herself. And our instinct in those moments is usually to keep that a secret. We don't want to tell people about this. But she told people about it. She told her colleagues about it. She told the hospital about it. The hospital immediately separated the two gentlemen to make sure that this would not happen. But then they also created a policy that would ensure that this would never happen to any patient or any nurse by making sure that people with similar last names would never be put in the same room. And it seems so simple and so obvious, but it's something that we keep failing at.
Mm-hmm. And I think that there's kind of a broader lesson in this story and this approach to sort of obsessing about these small failures to kind of learn. And that broader lesson is, in these complex systems, we don't know the details of what the failures are going to be. We don't know the particular things that are going to happen because there's all these interactions we can't predict. Mm-hmm. And so what we need groups, organizations that see these small problems and speak up, and that information kind of comes to the top and informs the strategy, helps people, change their approach, helps people learn. And I think that's one area where we talked with John Dickerson, the CBS This Morning anchor, about this, and he's a longtime political reporter. And one of the things that came up in the conversation is just that politics is not a system that learns, right? Politics is a system where a policy is crafted after a lot of horse trading. It's kind of thrown over the wall. We see what the effects are, and then maybe fix it 10 years later, if that. And so, yes, we very much see, I think, a lack of this. The things that you would want to help you manage a complex system, those are almost the exact things that our current political system selects against.
Perfect, right. That's not how we do it.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, it's not our way. Yeah, right, perfect. It seems like it's time to talk about some of the solutions now. A lot of the new questions came in, and you guys are leaning in that direction. So why don't do you want to do just a quick overview, and then we'll drill down a little bit deeper, but you have a general format for how to fix these problems. It's really simple and beautiful if you want to give an overview, and then we'll definitely talk about each of these steps more fully.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of what our beautiful... I think we think of it as there's kind of three things we can do broadly. We can think about things from the perspective of our system. So add transparency, one of the things that Andras said. We can also just explicitly account for complexity and coupling to try and understand where we should kind of keep our attention. We can learn from our systems. We can get transparency through learning, which is a little bit about what we've been talking about. And we can also learn through a number of different mechanisms how to make better decisions in our systems. And so I think for us, the bulk of the book really is dedicated to solutions, and they kind of roughly slot into these three categories. Mm-hmm.
Well, let's start with the last one then. I know that's last in the book, but it's just that's what everybody seems to want to talk about, and it was my favorite part as well. So, and since I'm asking the questions.
Yeah, here we go.
So how do we make better decisions then?
Well, one of the things that surprised us really about that particular set of solutions is how important diversity is as a safeguard against failure. And we often think about diversity and the benefits of diversity as something that it's this beautiful big group hug where we all come together and we bring these different perspectives and we all learn from each
Kumbaya.
other. And in reality, at least that's what the research in the past 5 or so years has been showing is that diversity is actually often much more painful than beautiful, but that's exactly why it's so helpful in these in managing these complex and unforgiving systems, because it makes everybody on a team or in a group more skeptical. And it's not about one particular group being better or smarter than another. It's just that when we are in these diverse groups, we tend to question each other's judgment much more often, and we don't copy each other's mistakes quite as frequently. And one of the things that we see that also surprised us about this is that it's not just surface level diversity. It's not just things like race and gender. We see very similar effects with things like diversity in professional backgrounds. One line of research that we look at in the book is on small community banks in the US. And what that research shows is that banks, the small banks that had boards that were dominated by bankers, lots and lots of bankers with lots of deep expertise in banking, were actually more likely to fail than banks that had boards with a mix of bankers and people who were really sort of amateurs in that field. They were doctors, lawyers, accountants, nonprofit people, journalists, things like that. And I mean, that's pretty surprising, right? You would think that bankers are pretty good at managing banks. But it turns out that if it's just bankers, they are not that great.
Yep.
And the research really showed that the reason that they weren't that great is because bankers gave each other the benefit of the doubt. Whereas if you had a doctor there, even a handful of them, they would say, hey, listen, we don't understand this. Like, we're not going to be able to make a decision about whether to, pursue this product line or expand in this way unless you can explain it to us more. And so it really was just that having that kind of diversity opened up the ability for these groups to question.
Mm-hmm. Give the example of Theranos.
Yeah, Theranos. Right? I mean, we've been talking about this.
I personally, I have to say this. I really hate needles, so I really wanted Theranos to work out. I really believed in it, and so did, I think, so many other people.
Right. Right, and it was such a, founded by this extremely talented woman in the Bay Area, kind of a maybe a pinpoint of diversity in the bro tech culture, I believe is the term. And yet when you look at the board, all of the outside directors were white, male, and over like 60.
Average age 73.
Yes,
right?
Thank you. Average age 73. Which, I mean, it's not to say that 73-year-olds can't provide excellent input to a board, but what it is saying is that having such homogeneity, and in particular, the board was very, they had a lot of formers on it, a lot of, former Secretary of State, former generals, and that kind of prestige, coupled with that lack of diversity, really created an environment where I'm not sure that there was much governance going on. Right. I'm not sure if there really was an outside perspective, and yet that company, was managing hundreds of millions of dollars.
So these people who had similar backgrounds, all of them really, really widely respected people, they trusted each other rather than questioned each other. And that's what you're saying is the solution, is to have diversity that leads you to say, really, why is that? What is that?
It's interesting. It's sort of, it looks like diversity is kind of like a speed bump. It makes things less smooth, but it sort of wakes us up. Yeah. And when we run these studies and put some people in homogeneous groups and others in diverse groups, and they do these tasks, and often on the complex tasks, the diverse groups end up doing much better. But when you ask them afterwards, how did you feel about that? Do you think your team did well? What was your experience like? Usually people on homogeneous groups think that they did really well, and they enjoyed the experience. Oh, we finished each other's sentences. Right. It was so smooth.
Yeah. And
these diverse groups, like, oh no, they were arguing with me, and I had to explain everything, and it just went on and on and on. And it's this paradox that diversity things makes things harder, but as a result, it makes things better.
Right. So some of the problems that would erupt, some of the little nuances that create the ultimate catastrophe, they're weeded out and people can see them because there's more questioning going on. There's more discussion. There's more insight in a diverse board or any group of people
Right.
in any
Should we
organization.
pay attention to whatever little
Right.
warning sign has emerged? Is
Right.
this something we need to worry about?
Right.
And actually, it's even kind of better than that in diverse groups, in that there's actually just more facts shared, and
Yeah.
and the people when there's a great study that shows that there's more facts shared, and the people are they remember those facts better. So I think it's just triggering us cognitively to work harder.
Yeah. Yeah, you said that people that have similar backgrounds believe that they also have the same information. They don't even question that the
Right.
other person knows something different, and they also assume that the other person has the same beliefs. So those things aren't even challenged or questioned, and that's where complexity is dissolved, is through the questioning.
Right, and it incidentally, I mean, it gets really nuanced with that study about bankers we talked about. Those banks only failed more when they were operating in a complex environment. They only failed more when there was competition or they were dealing with more complex financial products. And so there really is this sense where obviously there's a moral case for diversity in many, many contexts, but there is a moral and a decision-making quality case for diversity in a complex context.
Yeah, that's an amazing insight. So one of the other things you recommended was a pre-mortem. Can you tell us more about what that is and how that would help?
Yeah, the pre-mortem is a method developed by a psychologist named Gary Klein. And this is a very simple method where before we roll out a big project or start something new, our team gets together, we sit down in a room, and we imagine that we have a crystal ball. We're looking into the crystal ball. It's 2 years from now, and our project has failed. But it has failed miserably. It's a spectacularly terrible project. It's so bad that we can't even look at each other if we are passing each other in the hallway. And
It's embarrassing.
it's embarrassing, but the moderator running this exercise doesn't tell you why. They just tell you that there's this terrible outcome that has happened. And then we spend 5 or 10 minutes where each of us takes a piece of paper and writes down a little history that led to that failure, or just a couple of bullet points of factors that led to that failure. And what the research shows is that if we think about risks in this way, rather than the usual way, which is let's just sit down and think about what could go wrong. But in the first case, in the pre-mortem case, we tell people something has gone wrong. It's 2 years from now and things are terrible. The outcome has already happened. Now we are just using the power of hindsight to come up with reasons for why it happened. It turns out when we use this pre-mortem method versus the standard method, we come up with more specific reasons for why a failure might occur. We come up with a much broader set of reasons. And also if we do this as a group, it has this great kind of liberating effect where, normally in an organization, we want to show that we are smart by coming up with solutions, and this sort of liberates people to show that they are smart by raising problems.
It's like a little hack for our brains that sort of really engages one of the parts of the human brain that's really amazing, which is the storytelling part. And it sort of gets that storytelling part to, as Andres said, come up with a story for why this failure happened, and then we'll share it. And it doesn't mean we're not going to do this project, but what it does mean is, listen, now we've come up with some ways which we think this failure can happen, and we're going to be able to mitigate it. We're going to come up with solutions. We're going to figure stuff out.
And this is something you can use in everyday life. Chris and I used this before phone calls with publishers. That was one example. Even two people can do this. Let's imagine this was terrible disaster. Never want to talk to these people ever again, and vice versa. And let's think about the reasons, and then let's think about how we address that, and then we head into the call.
Right.
Nice. Good job. So I'm going to backtrack a little bit because we've had 3 questions now come in asking about applying your system, both of how failures exist or occur, but also solutions to our educational system. So both of these we're looking at public schools, but and school systems, not universities. So what do you think?
I think I'll share kind of a story from my life. I have a 5-year-old who was 4 years old for most of the writing of the book, and I would say that our morning routine was pretty much always a meltdown. The process of getting ready for preschool, finding jackets, finding shoes, you would think that every night a hurricane came through our house and just scattered everything. But we were doing all this research on how teams handle these kind of crisis situations. And so I was like, oh, well, let's see how this would work in our home. And so what we started to do is we started to have basically a short meeting every weekend, and we still try to do this. 5 minutes, we just talk about what worked well last week, what didn't go well, and what are we going to try next week. So 3 pretty simple questions. 5 minutes is sort of the attention span kind of a 5-year-old. And I mean, really what this is, and some of you probably recognize this is kind of how agile programming works, right? It's sort of like what worked well, what didn't, what are we going to do, and what are we going to do as an organization to kind of iterate. And it turns out you can apply this in your homes. I'm happy to say our morning routine is much smoother now because what we did was we found stuff that worked and we threw away stuff that didn't work, and we were kind of building. And somebody asked me like, well, why do you keep doing this, right? Haven't you found a system? But the brain of a 5-year-old is a very, it changes a lot. And so, what worked 2 weeks ago may not work anymore. Kind of like with your question with the retail. And so that's maybe a long-winded way of saying that I think that this is what schools need to be able to do to figure out how to deal with the challenges that they are in many ways, the last social safety net for many of their students, the challenges that technology is changing everything, and the challenges that we have no idea what the workforce is going to look like that our, kindergartners or 5th graders are starting now. And it's actually maybe similar to the politics question. I mean, what we need organizations that can try things and see what works and see what doesn't and iterate. And I don't think that that's the strength of a lot of public school systems. Yeah.
Okay. We also have had a question about if you could apply this to natural disasters, and I know you did in your book, but this is earthquakes, wildfires, tornadoes. Anything in your research cover system failures with regard to our response to natural disasters?
Yeah, we do. And, in some ways, people and that's not really our primary area, but people who study natural disasters often say that there are no natural disasters, right? If there's an earthquake that happens in the middle of nowhere, no one notices, or at least it's not a disaster. It's just a natural event. It becomes a disaster because of all these things that we do as humans: build cities, build systems, and I think a lot of the lessons that we see around, how to run a meeting, how to come up with projections around. How robust a seawall needs to be, how much money should we be spending on a particular kind of project to protect ourselves from these kinds of failures, those apply very directly to the disaster kind of preparation and mitigation phase.
And I want to add something to that, which is, we as a country, I think we, generally speaking, have really capable and highly trained first responders to disasters. So, fire services, EMTs, paramedics, these people are amazing. Urban search and rescue teams, they're amazing in how they can show up on a scene, mitigate a problem, save people's lives. But what we see these kind of groups struggle with is what happens when the disaster gets bigger than what one organizational unit can respond to, right? So as soon as there's coordination across kind of bureaucratic lines. I mean, I think the wildfires the tragic wildfires that just happened here in Northern California are a great example of this, where, it was really a crisis that went from, kind of danger to catastrophe very, very quickly. And I think part of what you see is the challenge was in coordinating across these different units. And, there are lots of lessons that we can take from organizations that have figured out how to kind of manage and learn and respond to crises. And I think we just need to do, I think we need to do a better job of figuring out the coordination aspect of it, because the fire doesn't care if, this is the Napa-Sonoma county boundary.
Well, what is, generally speaking, the challenge in taking these fixes and moving ahead? Like, why do organizations not change?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's something that we have run into just so much while we were working on this book, is that, a lot of the solutions that we have come across that work really well in some organizations are at least seemingly very simple, but that doesn't mean that they are easy. They often kind of go against our natural instincts. We feel more comfortable in a homogeneous group than in a diverse group. We don't want to hear bad news. If we see small warning signs, but the whole system doesn't fail, then we often conclude that, things are pretty good. Our system was robust. It didn't all fall apart. And so a lot of these things that seem to work are not very natural things for humans to do. And while maybe 20 or 30 or 50 years ago, when our systems were just so much simpler and so much less unforgiving, we could get away without these solutions in most of our industries. I don't think that's enough anymore, and I think now we have to start doing these things that might not feel as natural and simple.
Great.
Can I share another big problem?
Please.
Bosses are big problems, and it's actually really interesting. So bosses, so many of us are both bosses and bossied, I don't know how to say it, bosses and, somebody who manages people, but also someone who is managed. We're employees and we're bosses. And what's really interesting is what the research shows is that bosses, generally speaking, think of themselves as kind of open and friendly, and they have these open door policies. But also, generally speaking, that's not how employees see their bosses, right? So one of the things that we know about managing these kind of big complex systems is you need the bad news to kind of go up as quickly as possible. And so if you have a boss that they think of themselves as open, but because they're sending these subtle power cues, or because of the way that they've responded to bad news in the past, which is a very natural human thing to do, that tends to suppress the ability for bad news to kind of move up to where it needs to. And that's really, that's kind of, it's ironic because, as I said, many of us are in sort of both of those positions. The good news is it turns out there's some pretty great research on very specific things that bosses can do to kind of soften their power cues in the kind of parlance of sociologists, and help that information move up where it needs to, like, to the people that need to know about it.
Okay. Somebody wants to have you talk a little bit about the mountain climbing example from your book, and maybe you could apply the fix to that example.
Sure. Do you want to talk about it?
Sure. We spent some time looking at mountaineering firms that take people up Mount Everest and similar mountains. And we thought this is such a fascinating case because, that mountain, that whole environment is going to be complex no matter what. There's often not a lot of visibility in terms of how the weather might be. It's also very unforgiving, very tightly coupled. All it takes is one misstep and you're in big trouble. And yet some teams and organizations in that space figured out how to be safer. And they didn't do it by implementing these sort of large fixes that that change the system fundamentally. I mean, after all, you can't move the mountain. It's going to be there. The air is going to be thin. It's going to be cold. It's going to be a terrible environment. Anyway, but they found out that there's a bunch of these small things that they can do to fix small things before they snowball into this big failure. So one example is a lot of the better and safer mountaineering firms spend a lot of time obsessing over food and having a designated chef and a kitchen and all that kind of stuff, which wasn't the case in the 90s, even in the early 2000s. And when we ask them about this, they often say, well, it's not just about the food. It's really a kind of safety system, because it means that now team leaders will have one fewer thing to worry about. People are not going to get sick. People will be well fed, and that's something they can control. And that's one example. But once you do enough of these small things and fix enough of or eliminate enough of these small problems, you can make the system a lot safer, even if it stays very complex and unforgiving. And in many ways, that's a very inspirational and optimistic lesson, because I think a lot of the systems we have been talking about, from our smart homes to our cars to high finance, are not going to become less complex. They'll be more complex and more unforgiving, but we can figure them out.
Right.
And the same is true also of like when we make a really elaborate holiday meal. So if you make a big Thanksgiving dinner, there's some element of it that is. There's fundamentally going to have to be a lot going on at the same time as the turkey finishes and you make the gravy and all this stuff. And so what you can do is you can do what these mountaineering people do. You can take care of some things ahead of time. Make what you can 3 days ahead of time, so you can kind of reduce the coupling in the system. But you can also reduce the complexity by the way you prepare. So make sure that you have salt and olive oil and toilet paper, right? So that you don't have to run out on Thanksgiving morning and, go to
Speaking from experience.
Right, yeah, well. This is a different kind of meltdown, but my family, we did have a toilet clog one Thanksgiving, and I don't think that there was anything we could have done to prepare for that. But anyway, but if you make sure you have these staples that you're going to need, then you save yourself. There's always going to be something unexpected, and the more you can reduce that, the more you can focus on the part of the system that you can't change.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. All right, who's the VP of Common Sense, and why do we need one?
Yeah, so the sports writer Bill Simmons talks about, basically he thinks every sports team should just have a vice president of Common Sense. It's a fan. He or she doesn't come to any meetings except when the team's about to make a big decision, like to trade a player or something like that. And what this VP of Common Sense does is, they come to that meeting and maybe they get a hot dog and a beer or whatever, and the team explains, the management explains what they want to do, and the fan says like, no, that's a stupid idea. Here's why. Or they say, yeah, that's a great idea. That sounds good. Why didn't you guys do that before? And what this is an example of is actually something that turns out to be quite effective. And really, I mean, teams from the rocket scientists at Jet Propulsion Labs to lots of other examples, they use outsiders in a way that helps them kind of. It's another kind of mechanism of getting the same thing we can get from diversity, right? It sort of breaks up the groupthink by bringing an outsider in. It breaks up the groupthink, and it kind of prevents them from making a stupid decision. Mm-hmm. I think the example I like to think about. I mean, I think what's going on with Facebook now is really indicative that as a company they could have used some outsiders to sort of channel how the public might respond to some of these things. But I think, Apple's, the thing that came out recently, slowing down the performance of the iPhone with the battery, I mean, consumers were pretty outraged. And whether or not that's a rational response, whether or not Apple was making a rational engineering decision, I think the engineers who were making that decision could have used kind of a vice president of Common Sense to help sort of sense how the rest of us would respond.
And I'd add that, one of the lessons we learned while working on this book is that these same principles that help the engineers at NASA and might have helped Facebook or Apple also apply really to our everyday lives. And we can all have a vice president of common sense, at least occasionally create one or appoint one. One story where we have seen this so clearly is involved this young woman back actually in Toronto, my hometown, who was about to buy her first home. She was very excited about it. She's been saving up a lot of money for it. And then when she was done with school, the summer came and she went around looking at places, and she really fell in love with this condo. It was on the waterfront in Toronto. It was August. They have this big pool on one of the floors. It looked great. She could really imagine her life there. It was also beautifully staged. She was really taken by it. It had this sort of vintage beach theme. And she was like, this is it. This is the life I want. This is the place for me. Even though if you look at it objectively, the place wasn't in a great location for her. It wasn't the right setup, the right layout. And Toronto, I live in Toronto. There's a snowstorm there right now, and it's April. So we have a very long winter, and August is not very representative of most of the year. And she fell in love with this place, and she almost made a mistake. I mean, it could have been a real kind of big personal meltdown, and we often see this with these cases where people have to make a decision that they only get to make once or twice or 3 times during a lifetime. So she hasn't had a lot of practice with it. So just as the NASA engineers, she decided to appoint an outsider. And what she did was that she emailed the listing for this place and a couple of other ones to a friend who used to live in Toronto, knew her preferences, but was no longer there, wasn't involved in the decision, and said, look, these are the 5 places I'm looking at. What do you think? And a friend wrote back and said, well, I like that place in downtown, and I like that little house, but you should not get that waterfront condo because it's really cold and windy, and the location is not great for you, and the layout is terrible. And that was this huge wake-up call to her. And I think I think that was one of the big revelations for us as we were working on this book, is that we can all learn from some organizations that have figured this out. And in the case of something like aviation, it often, those lessons were written in blood. They really took a lot of human tragedy to figure out. But we don't have to do that. We can just learn and apply these same lessons to our everyday decisions.
Mm-hmm. Great. So you'd mentioned Facebook earlier, and we do have a couple of questions that people are wondering. How did this happen? I think you probably, although you aren't in the company, I bet you have some ideas. And what solution? They have no trust right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think from the outside, it's hard to know the details, as you said, the details of exactly what happened. But I think what we do see is we see this really as this example that we're kind of researching and writing about over and over again, where, I mean, a series of small failures really, snowball. And I think in the Facebook case, I mean, it's hard to imagine, even a month ago, if you had said, hey, there's going to be a rogue academic that, destroys trust in Facebook and causes its stock price to plummet, that would have been a pretty surprising thing, right? So it really, I mean, even though the consequences are big, and even though I think there's a lot to the problem, in many ways it does kind of stem from this sort of chain of inappropriate events. Or, I mean, kind of like we talked about before, this complexity created the opportunity for this wrongdoing, and I think this is a quintessential example of that.
It seems like there's a lack of morals there as well.
Well, I don't know if I can...
I mean, can we apply that, or is that just being judgmental?
I don't know if I can speak to that. I mean, you're the marketing professor, so you're kind of embedded in I think how we think about how firms market themselves. But from our perspective, what we see is yes, there's kind of a lack of outsiders. As Andras talked about before, there is maybe a lack of sensitivity to these small problems that might spiral into these big issues. And I suspect, although we haven't looked at it, we haven't done the research, I would not be surprised if there were a certain amount of homogeneity in either surface level diversity or in the professional background of the people that are in the room making some of the really important decisions there. And excuse me, on the diversity element, you know, in the book, we don't just stop at saying diversity is good, you should have diversity. Like, there's actually a lot of good research showing what moves the needle, what helps companies hire and promote more diverse workforces, and some really surprising things that intuitively seem like they should work, but actually turn out not to work at all. And so there really are things that especially well-resourced companies like, you know, the Facebooks of the world can do to help that problem.
Mm-hmm. So what bits of your book, you guys have been on a terrific media tour, and you've had a lot of questions asked and a lot of feedback on your book. So what are you getting the most feedback on? What are the parts of your book that really seem to be supercharging people?
Well, diversity. I mean, I think that we have seen all sorts of reactions to that.
Yeah.
You know, some people love the idea, others hate the idea. Somebody just tweeted at us this morning, and it said, they say diversity is one of our best safeguards against failure. Won't be buying the book. And you know, I mean, we don't really have a kind of
this isn't our opinion,
right?
I guess,
right.
Like this is research.
Yeah, we are just reporting the research, looking at the evidence, and in fact, it's not a completely rosy picture about diversity either. It's very hard, and that's why it works. But it seems to trigger those reactions in sort of either direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we just have time for a couple more questions. And one of them, like taking a step back as a consumer. So a couple of people have asked a question around this. So as a consumer of other businesses,
right,
how do we know which businesses we should put our trust in? What are the external cues that we can look to?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's going to become a more and more relevant question to us as you know, customers, as people. I mean, I just think about the things, the devices that we're inviting into our homes, you know, from Alexa to Google Home, the way we invite Facebook into our lives. And I think as consumers, I think what we're going to see is a shift to where consumers are able to ask these questions, I think in a more sort of sophisticated way. So what we would suggest is that, you know, looking for areas like where we're increasing the amount of connectedness in our lives and we're increasing the dependency on this technology, as we see in something like a smart home. I mean, those are areas where we are more likely to see meltdowns. And we've already started to see some of these, from, you know, Nests that go crazy and turn the heat all the way up, to Nests that go crazy and turn the heat all the way down, to, you know, the smart power grid where people have connected you know, electric meters. And so I think one of the things we need to start to do is to cultivate a little bit of a skepticism for these things. Mm-hmm. I think one big area that we didn't really get into much tonight, where we often don't have a choice in a direct way, is our cars, right? I mean, our cars are computer controlled. I have a Subaru. It's like 2016, and I can look up stock prices on my dashboard. And I don't know why, but this is something that Subaru decided they wanted to add. And so as a result, the car is connected to the internet. And what we know is that cars are vulnerable to hacking. You know, we saw security researchers break into some Jeep Cherokees and do crazy things with the cars, and Chrysler did a big recall and all of this thing. So I think, yeah, we need to start approaching this in a little bit of a different way as a consumer. And I think that businesses are going to have to start doing this, because these failures are just going to be increasing in their frequency and their costliness. Mm-hmm,
mm-hmm. So we need a voice of the consumer.
Yeah, I think we need a voice of the consumer, and I think our hope with this book, as Andras said before, these solutions, a lot of them are really simple. They involve things like how we run meetings or the pre-mortem that we talked about before, but that doesn't mean they're easy.
Right.
And our hope with this book is really to provide a little bit of a perspective that's backed by research and start a conversation around this stuff. And our hope is that by starting that conversation, we as consumers, but also companies will start to realize how necessary and important it is that we change our way of approaching these systems, because the cost of not doing it is just too big anymore.
Mm-hmm. That's a great conclusion. Andras, do you have any final words for us, any advice, anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, you asked about trusting companies and which companies to trust or not. And, one of the big lessons, as you've heard tonight from this book, is about the importance of transparency. And it was really fascinating to us when we were looking at this whole series of companies that defrauded people or committed some other kind of corporate wrongdoing, is that how often they describe themselves as famously secretive.
Right.
Theranos is an example of that, or Enron, where Jeff Skilling, the CEO, said, "Well, I'm sorry, it's a black box. I can't explain to you how the money is flowing into this, but it's a good black box. Mm-hmm. It's growing at a very high rate." And in fact, with Theranos, I mean, you can't make this stuff up. Their technology was literally a black box, and it really was something that nobody really understood. So I think if you hear those phrases, famously secretive, or this is a black box, but it works very well, stay away.
Yeah, nice, very good. All right, well, Our thanks to Chris Clearfield and Andras Tilschek, authors of Meltdown, Why Our Systems Fail and What We Can Do About It. And I'd like to remind everybody that there'll be books on sale out in the lobby in just a moment. And I'm Kit Yarrow, and now this meeting in the Commonwealth Club of California, the place where you are in the know, is adjourned.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.